Hello, everyone. This is a review video for the exam on Monday on Judith Jarvis Thompson's Defense of Abortion and Don Marquis' Why Abortion is Immoral. I'm going to go over the study questions, maybe have a few other things to say. Number one, at the beginning of her essay, Thompson says, I am inclined to think also that we shall probably have to agree that the fetus has already become a person well before birth. Given this admission, how can her essay be a defense of abortion? Well, clearly, admitting, for the sake of the argument at least, that the fetus, as she does admit, for the sake of argument, that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception, it would seem to rule out abortion, at least morally. But, we know that she has a certain way of thinking about it. I think that the most important thing is the sequence of thought where if we grant that somebody's a person, then what goes along with that is that they have the right to life. So that makes it, how can you say abortion is morally defensible if you grant that the fetus has a right to life from the moment of conception? And I think that the way she handles that is quite interesting. Right? The right to life is not the right not to be killed. Um, so that, well, then what is it a right to? And she says, well, it's the right not to be killed unjustly. So just because the fetus is killed and is a person, it does not mean that its right to life has been violated. It would have to be also that the fetus had been killed unjustly to say that it violated its right to life. And then the question is whether it is. Right? That, I think, that question is clarified by also saying that the right to life does not give you the right to everything that you might need to live. That is, the right to life does not bring along with it a guarantee of access to everything that you might need to live. And then so the question becomes, does the fetus have a right to the use of a woman's body? And her answer to that is clearly no. So I think that path of thinking is how she can admit, for the sake of the argument, the outset that the fetus becomes a person at the moment of conception with a defense of abortion. Number two, does Thomson think there is a right to life? Yes. Yes. But again, heavily qualified, that the right to life does not mean either the right to everything that you might need to live or the right not to be killed per se, but just the right not to be killed unjustly. Number three, if keeping the violinist who was hooked up to you alive will kill you, do you have the right to unhook him? Would it be murder? She says no. No, it would not. That is, if you found yourself in that situation, hooked up to him or her, um, and you were told that if that the violinist needed your body, access to your kidneys, whatever, to live, and that this would kill you, you have every right to unhook yourself. And I think that she justifies that by saying that the violinist, despite the fact that they need your body to live, has no right of access to it. So you are not denying them anything that that they have a right to when you unhook yourself. So it would not be murder. Wouldn't be unjust. Couldn't be murder. Number four, what significance does Thomson give to the fact that, quote, the mother owns the house? Well, I think this is embedded in a conversation about whether a third party has the right to perform an abortion. That is, you have the right, she says, to unhook yourself from the famous violinist, but does somebody else have the right to do it? And she says yes. They can't be compelled to do it if they don't want to, but they have the right to do it justly for you because you own the house, so to speak. You have a right to the use of your body, but no one else does, unless, of course, in this complicated way, you grant them that right. So, number five, the only thing that can save my life is a visit from Henry Fonda. Do I have a right to a visit from him? The answer to that is no, according to Thomson. not even if he's right across the room. Um, Again, it's an illustration of that idea that the right to life does not give you the right to everything you might need to live. According to Thomson, does killing someone necessarily violate the right to life? The answer is no. Only killing someone unjustly violates the right to life. Number 7, what does Thomson have to say about the claim that the unborn child has a right to the use of the mother's body? That's quite a well-formed question. I think it boils down to this. It's situational. First of all, the only person who can give such a right to an unborn child is the mother. And secondly, it's not clear what the circumstances are. So I think, as we've said many times in class, the unexplained or unexplored avenue in her essay is under what conditions it could be said that the child has a right to the use of the mother's body. She leaves the possibility open. But one of the things I said is that the presumption is that the child does not automatically have a right to the use of the mother's body, and that it would have to be something that is established. That is, that through some act of her own, the mother gave that right to the unborn child. But it cannot be presumed that the child or the fetus has a right. Number 8, what is the difference between indecent and unjust? Well, that's a key distinction at the end. Well, I think that her position is that probably no abortion could be said to be unjust, but they could be said in some circumstances to be indecent. I don't know if she really defines decency and indecency, but she rather gives illustrations. If the grandma gives one of the brothers a box of chocolates and he doesn't share with his little brother, that's indecent but not unjust, because the um, little brother, it would be good to give it to him, some to him, but you don't have to because he doesn't have any right to them. So suppose that, indecency is doing something, denying somebody something or doing something, but really in this context, denying something to somebody that you really should give them, but they have no right to, I suppose. Whereas, something, if you deny something to somebody that have a right to, that's an injustice. But if you deny something where you ought to give it to them, but don't, but they have no right to it, that could merely be indecent. Number 9, what are the different varieties of Samaritan that Thomson describes? I mean, there's the minimally decent Samaritan, there's the splendid Samaritan. I think that the important thing is that, for me, is the minimally decent Samaritan, if that's the language that she used, because she says that is a standard of decency below which we must not fall, which is also, I think, questionable. But there's different levels of doing things that you don't have to do for people, or giving things to people that you don't have to give them, which is, of course, an important part of question 8. Let's switch over and look at the Don Marquis study questions. Number 1, according to Marquis, why are the principles of the anti-abortionist often too broad? Well, because sometimes if you say that, for instance, if you say that all human life is sacred and cannot be killed, or at least prima facie cannot be killed, well, a cancer cell is technically human life, right? So they have to narrow that down. Um, why are those of the pro-choice are too narrow? Because, well, if you say that for instance, that the fetus has no moral status and therefore it's not unjust to kill it because it's not a person or doesn't have the faculties or characteristics of a person, rationality, moral, a moral sense, self-awareness, then it's too narrow. because it also excludes babies and people in comas and things like that, who we do recognize would be wrong to kill. So it needs to, so it's just typical that the anti-abortionists will, their principles will be too broad, and those of the pro-choice position will be too narrow. Why will they both have problems either narrowing or broadening their principles? Well, I mean, they'll start begging the question. Right? For instance, you say to the anti-abortionist, well, does this include human cancer cells? And they say, well, no, you know what I mean, a human being. Well, that's what you have to prove. I mean, you're assuming what you have to prove, and that is that the fetus is a human being with all the rights and protections that come with being a human being. So they'll have problems. If you say to the pro-choicer, well, from what you've said, it's not wrong to kill infants, they will have problems narrowing, or excuse me, broadening their principles to include infants without begging the question. Number two, how does Marquis propose to resolve the apparently unresolvable conflict between the anti-abortion and pro-choice positions? By ignoring the problem of personhood entirely. That is, whether the fetus is a person, whether the fetus is a full human being, which is usually what people mean. Which is when people use that full human being, they really mean what the philosophers mean by person. But to ignore all that and instead offer a theory of the wrongness of killing in general, and then seeing how that applies to abortion. Number three, according to Marquis, what makes killings being like us? What makes killing beings like us wrong? You take away our future. So we recognize that it's wrong to kill you, it's wrong to kill me. What makes it wrong is that you take away our futures. So that leads to number four. What are the consequences for the ethics of abortion of Marquis' theory of the wrongness of killing? Well, what have we established? Number one, well, what have we presumed? Number one, it's wrong to kill you, it's wrong to kill me. What we can, and then we say, well, the reason that it's wrong is to take away our futures. And the conclusion is it would be wrong to kill anything where you would be taking away from it a future like ours. That's the key, right? And he says, well, it can be presumed that the standard fetus has a future like ours, so it would be wrong to kill it. Number five, what are the discontinuation and desire counts of the wrongs of killing? Why does Marquis reject them? I think that the big idea here, not to get into the details of it because we don't have a chance. Take the desire count. You know, the idea that the wrongness of killing is that everybody can be presumed to have a desire to live. Therefore, it'd be wrong to thwart that desire. Well, what about people who don't have desires to live? At least temporarily, we recognize it would be wrong to kill them. So discontinuation of current experiences. What if somebody doesn't have any current experiences? I mean, they're asleep or in a coma or they're a fetus. Don't we still think it would be wrong to kill? I mean, so I think that he thinks there are obvious merits to his argument that avoid some of the problems of the other ones. I don't want to get into that too much because I want to concentrate on what's covered in the earlier question. So, one more thing I'd like to say, and that is kind of like what came to me when I was summing up these two essays and what they sort of leave us with. I think what they leave us with. If we start with Thomson's essay, I think we start with a certain presumption. That is, if the question is whether a particular abortion is right or wrong, or just or unjust, and that is, if we're not think so much about the theory as about thinking about whether this particular instance is right or wrong. What do we start with? What questions do we ask ourselves? Well, I think there's one question that if you're using Thomson's framework that you ask yourself, and that is, and that's this, something like this. And, it's not clear, as I said in class, how we decide something like that. It may be that she's wrong even to, I think it's a possibility that she's wrong even to think of it that way, because there's no explicit way in which you can do that, because it would have to be the mother grants that right. There's no one else who can do it, right? So what would be implicitly such an irrevocably granted right? The questions are just really, really complicated. What if you're really trying to get pregnant, as I said in class? Some of you will do that. And what, can you not change your mind? If you are voluntarily trying to get pregnant and you get pregnant, does that mean that you have granted the fetus access to your body no matter what? If it threatens your life, if that child will be severely, severely, severely mentally and physically disabled, it's not clear at all under what conditions we could say that the fetus has the right of access to the mother's body, so that killing it would be unjust. But that, I think, is the question we ask. And maybe that there are such, maybe we would decide that there are such conditions where the right of access has been granted. But I think that that's where we start. We ask whether the fetus has such a right, because it cannot be presumed to have a right. So the burden of proof would be on somebody who was trying to say that the fetus did have a right. They'd have to come up with an argument. I think that if we look at Marquis, we ask a very different question about, a particular case of abortion, and that is essentially, does the fetus have a future like ours? Or will the fetus have a future like ours? He does say that there have to be exceptions to abortion where the loss to the mother or others would approach the seriousness of the loss of the entire future to the fetus. He does say that. But I think more importantly, the exceptions to abortion being immoral for Don Marquis would be those exceptions where we could not say, really, that the fetus did have a future like ours. I guess the most obvious reason we would do that is because of severe disability or a short. I think one of the things I said in class was that if you could presume, most likely for this fetus was a very short life filled with physical suffering with no mental goods that would offset that, then that could not really be said to be a future like ours, or at least a future why we value a future like ours. So, I think that there would be such cases where we could not say that the fetus had a future like ours. So there have to be exceptions. But as Marquis says, the exceptions would probably be rare. Just as I think, on the other side, the exceptions to the idea that the mother didn't have or the baby had, that the baby didn't, or the fetus didn't have a right of access would be rare.